We're here today with today's edition of Digital Identity 360 live from the floor at the Digital Identity Summit in San Francisco, and I'm privileged to be here with Tom Brown of LexisNexis. Tom, welcome to the show and to the summit.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure.
Great. So, Tom, you just delivered, an hour ago a very interesting speech and really provided some amazing context to our audience. And one of the themes among many was just sort of the fusion of offline data with digital data and how that helps LexisNexis build an even richer data set and solve more scenarios and deliver better value and use cases. So I'd like to just talk a little bit about that, of just how you see that evolving over time, sort of the merger of the offline world with the online world.
Yeah, I think there's really two dynamics in the future that really are going to help bring about stronger tools for fraud mitigation, risk mitigation. Exactly what you point out, merging the real identities, the physical identities to the digital world. I think that both applies to consumer and small businesses. I mean, keep in mind that we have to be worried about entities as a whole. As banks and other enterprises engage in the economy, they're engaging with customers, and they can take many forms. So, very excited about working with ThreatMetrix in that regard, bringing the strength of our alternative data repository really into fully capable from a digital perspective. And then the other dimension is really the cross-border dynamics. I mean, so often now, if you can't handle transactions globally, it's a real efficiency drain. It can be introduce a lot of additional risk. So we're excited to tackle both those challenges with you guys.
One of the really interesting sort of eye-opening themes was just the discussion around the underserved or even the underbanked around the world. It's a challenge a lot of us don't think about here in North America, but would love to hear just a little bit more from you around how big of a challenge is that around the world, and what strategies has LexisNexis put in place to really help address that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because a lot of people think about the underbanked challenge only related to creditworthiness. Mm-hmm. And one of the points in the discussion this morning was that if you don't have the data and the insight to credit evaluation, well, you likely don't have that insight to mitigate fraud. You don't have the insight to vet customers from a anti-money laundering perspective. So it is critical to look at all dimensions. And as I mentioned this morning, in the most developed country in the world, you've got tens of millions of underbanked consumers, and many of those consumers are very strong credit risk, very desirable customers. They just happen not to be in the mainstream, the mainstream economy in some respects. And then, of course, as you go around the world, the situation only gets more dynamic. I mentioned as well on China that there's more underbanked consumers in China than there are consumers in the U.S.
It's an amazing statistic. I was blown away when I heard that.
But think about the potential for growth. You have China, arguably, either one or two in terms of economic activity today with the U.S., but then you've got an entire consumer population that can come online if they're able to mainstream those consumers into traditional economic activity. That can really sustain a lot of growth, not only for China, but for the world. And bring those consumers to a higher standard of living. When someone is excluded from the financial sector, from the economic sector, they have a lot less flexibility. I mean, just think about what it would be like to not have a credit card, and to not have the ability to finance a car or what have you. So it really does have the potential to unleash greater value for really everyone in society. And the other dynamic that people don't often connect is the linkage between the underbanked and some of these dramatic events that happen in the world around terrorism. Yes. A lot of times the terrorism is being driven because of marginalized individuals.
Right, with no path out.
No path. And so if they're able to have a path and you can bring them in and more growth, more opportunity, it's not going to solve these problems overnight. And as I mentioned, it is something that requires collaboration, not only of companies like ours, but also industry, bringing industry together to solve those problems.
That's right.
And I think it's certainly going to be a time when innovation around cross-border and digital to physical really are going to be the key solutions to that broader challenge.
Yeah. This collaboration theme in many ways, as I shared in some of my comments, on stage really sort of defines the ThreatMetrix business model, right? It's this globally shared intelligence, anonymized, encrypted, of course, to protect any PII, but that's really the foundation for enabling these downstream decisions, with the right level of context. Because there's a global data set across industries, diverse across geographies, and even use cases, it provides that rich context to make the very best decision, not just to root out the fraudsters, but to treat the good customers well, right, and enable a frictionless transaction. But when you think about sort of that level of globally shared context, I guess what are your thoughts on the future of what that might look like? How might that help LexisNexis sort of fuel your business going forward?
Right. Well, it's a big challenge. I mean, oftentimes when we talk about globalization, my customers will come to me and say, well, if you could just do what you do in the U.S. everywhere in the world, that would be great.
Sure.
Well, it's easy to say, but it's a very tall order. You're talking about each, 190 some odd jurisdictions, and you got other territories, each with their own set of privacy laws and different quality of data. Mm-hmm. So it is a very significant challenge. Now, we do operate global databases. For example, in the financial crime arena, we operate a database that covers entities in more than 240 countries and jurisdictions. So I think there are ways to begin to drive more inclusion and transparency around the world and across borders. And I think what you're doing with your device and your network that you've created, again, it shows great progress in that. And I think it's trying to figure out how can we further extend upon that. And I do think it'll require more collaboration from industry participants. I think in particular in the e-commerce space, I think there's a lot of collective value by sharing capabilities and experiences between various e-commerce companies to enable safer and more efficient transactions globally. So I don't know the exact answer, but I know some of the components, and we're certainly excited to embrace and going down that path.
That's right. Yeah, one of the themes you just talked about, sort of that merging of the offline world and the online world. Tremendous use cases from where we sit at ThreatMetrix. We are sort of digitally native in sort of the data attributes that we collect, but having visibility into some of the offline attributes to sort of round out a profile is compelling. And the reverse is true as well, with maybe sort of longer considered decision cycles, mortgages and others, where having some of the digital context to drive a richer decision, in the offline world, I think is equally compelling. Any thoughts on that? I mean, do you see all decisions ultimately being made in real time, or is there still a role for longer considered decision cycles that still can leverage the digital context?
Well, I mean, I think that really in our environment today, we can make decisions in milliseconds, and it just depends upon where it fits with the customer's workflow.
Yep.
But I think the point you bring up is that there's multiple domains that one has to consider. This digital domain where everything is instantaneous is obviously, timing is of the essence. When you're looking at credit risk and credit worthiness, while you develop your perspective over a longer period of time, you still may want to return the decision in milliseconds.
Yep.
And then especially in today's environment where everything is mobile based and consumers don't embrace delay. We all know that. I do from my personal experience. You should get frustrated and move on, and that can create its own risk issues. You get some adverse selection and so on. So I do think that increasingly decisions are going to be made more in real time, but again, it's going to be on multiple domains: fraud, financial crime, credit risk, and also, again, that dimension of both consumer and small business. I mean, so much of economic activity, just look at the U.S., how much economic activity is driven by small business entities. And as I mentioned this morning, they actually have a higher unbanked percentage than consumers. And so it creates another dynamic. The other aspect, we talk about the challenges of identifying trust with a consumer. Think about it from a business perspective. When kind of the information is it's not a natural person. It's much more complex, and that's going to continue to be a challenge. And I think just overall, everyone has to become more accustomed to dealing in real time with all types of entities.
That's right.
And working across borders in an efficient manner.
That's right. One of your themes that you hit in multiple ways on stage was, if you look at the world through the lens of the customer, which we all aspire to do all the time, is, across that buyer journey, not all transactions are created equal, right? How you risk someone or assume risk for an account creation might be very different from a login experience or a payment experience.
Right.
But without the right level of context, it's hard to distinguish sort of what's happening in real time and apply those right policies at that right moment in time. We, as an industry now, have evolved where we have those capabilities. We have the data, we have the policies, we have the context to make those decisions. How has that, that sort of capability helped fuel your business? New innovations, new markets, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, certainly new markets. I mean, one of the historical markets that we've been very strong is in financial services. And obviously it's because of, as you highlight, an account opening within a bank can represent a lot of exposure,
Sure.
Not only to the bank, but to the consumer in terms of the disruption and distress that identity fraud and the like can take. What we're seeing increasingly is all types of enterprises have to deal with this risk dynamic. So transactions that you would have thought wouldn't contain a lot of risk, whether it's a simple purchase transaction, whether it's an airline reservation, whether it's a hotel booking, whether it's a rewards activity on a loyalty program, whether it's the vetting of third parties within corporate entities. So you see everyone is kind of having to deal with these risk issues. And again, it's not just necessarily credit risk, but it also includes that financial crime component. Not only, we didn't talk much about it today in the talk, but in addition to anti-money laundering, preventing bribery. Bribery is a very significant drag on the global economy. I mean, just look at what's happened in Brazil over the past 5-6 years. So all that together, it's a much more risk-aware environment. And the key really is being able to engage with our customers within their workflow in a manner that allows them to service their customers, in a as frictionless way possible.
Excellent. So, in parting comments, just any final thoughts, as you reflect upon your past, day and a half here at the Digital Identity Summit, or even just the conversation that we've had?
Well, I think it's a great forum. We appreciate being allowed to participate. One of the things I mentioned earlier, and I think it's worth reiterating. So often we'll pick a particular technique or technology, and everyone will pile on and talk about how it's no longer effective because of some recent event. And the message, it needs to be very clear, is that no one technique or technology is foolproof. It's a matter of using these technologies and capabilities in a coordinated way to mitigate risk. And I think that's going to be even more important, as the threat environment continues to intensify.
The threat environment will become no less complex, and so you're absolutely right. This layered approach and having the right context to make the right decisions with the right tool set is really what it comes down to. So great insights, Tom. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
So that's our edition for Digital Identity 360. Thanks for joining us today.